Hi there. So you're interested in making pizza, but you don't really know which flour you should get or how to change your flour to a different flour and work with it. Now, if you watched a lot of YouTube videos or if you read a lot on making pizza, you'll see that there are a lot of recipes and they talk about different parameters. And it could be that you replicate those parameters exactly, but the results somehow don't work out for you. Now, that probably is because of the choice of flour. And in this video, I'll be talking about the choice of flour for pizza and what you should do with that. The first thing we're going to talk about is hydration. Now, hydration is the percentage of water in contrast to the weight of the flour. So if you have 1 kilo of flour, 60% would mean you have 600 milliliters of water. And different flours can actually absorb different percentages of water. So it could be that your flour can only absorb 60% of water, whereas other people might be maybe using flour that can absorb up to 80 or 90% water. And here is probably one of the biggest mistakes when following online recipes, because they might be using really strong flour that can absorb, let's say, 75% of water easily and still maintain a good shape of the dough ball, and your all-purpose flour that you're using can only absorb 62% or so easily, and you end up with a goo, basically. This is what happened to me early on, and I really hated it. This is why I'm mentioning this. So when looking at recipes online, understand that hydration is a parameter that is not fixed. So their recipe might be not suitable for you because of the hydration, because of the flour. Now, when people get the flour, they often talk about 0-0, type 0, whole grain. So what does that mean? I mean, that's how fine the grain is milled. And for the range of pizza, we usually have something between 0-0 and 1. And you can also mix these flours. And there's also some pre-mixed flours that you can buy. Now, the flour I have, for example, here is a type 0 flour. I really love it. It's really nice. The flavor of flour is also very important for pizza, and this one has a great flavor, and I prefer flavor over puffy crust. And you will see that some people choose their flour for appearance or for texture, and some people choose it for flavor, and both of them are okay. You just need to figure out what your preference is. The third parameter, maybe, that we should talk about is the protein levels, the W value, and the L value. Now, the protein levels are usually written on supermarket flour. It says something between, let's say, maybe 10 grams per 100 gram or 12 grams per 100 gram. What does that mean? Preferably, you want something that says 12 or more grams. But more doesn't mean better. The W value is a better indicator of flour strength usually. It will tell you not just how much water it can absorb, but also how long this water will remain in the dough. Normally with longer fermentations, your dough will basically start to fall apart. And this is what pizzaiolis usually prefer in terms of elasticity. So it's easier to open the dough. The dough has this nice matureness. It will taste a little maybe sour, a little pinch of extra flavor in there. And the other value is the L value, and that represents the elasticity. Now, normally I prefer something between 0.6 or 0.55 for elasticity, and mixing flours together will help you modify the W, the strength, and the L. And this will help you have different fermentation times with your flour. Now, the thing that's important is if you have a really strong flour that can absorb a lot of water, this will be actually a problem for you if you're trying to do shorter fermentations. If you really want to do shorter fermentations, you need to push that flour to a higher hydration, which might be a little too risky because it might be very hard to work with on your peel. So there's this balancing that you have to do all times, and this is not the easiest thing. So fermentation is where you get to understand what your flour is capable of, understand how you should be working with it, and where you can make changes for it to work for you. Now, online, people will often be talking about hydration and how high hydration they can do and how impressive that is, blah, blah, blah. It really doesn't matter. The fermentation works hand in hand with the hydration. So a higher hydration dough could be reacting the same way as a lower hydration dough that had a different fermentation process in the oven. And yes, higher hydration usually tends to be a little more puffy. It's not really constant. So this doesn't mean that it will always react like that. I personally would recommend you to get a flour for starting that is type 00 or type 0. My preference would be type 0. That has a good strength for it to manage 24 hours of room temperature fermentation. And you split those 24 hours in two. So you have 12 hours for the entire bulk of the dough to stay at room temperature in a bowl covered. And then after 12 hours, you take out that dough, you cut it into dough balls, and then you let the dough balls rest. You should not make your dough balls too close to baking because they will be very stiff and you will not be able to open them up. And you should maybe also not do the entire fermentation as balls because they might have bubbles that will burn a little easier. So it's really a balancing act. I personally recommend starting off with a hydration that is matching to your flour, and you need to then offset from that. So if you have all-purpose flour, you should really start with something like 60%, and you should see if you can increase it next time, not this time, next time. So work with it, and then next time you can increase it. If you have a stronger flour that you know can absorb 70% water, do that 70%, and you'll see what happens. Usually, if you have a kneading machine that is specifically for pizza dough or for dough, it will be able to help you make that flour absorb just a little more water, not necessarily a lot. And that also depends on your dough making process. If you're doing basinage, so if you're pouring in the water at the end slowly so that it can absorb a little easier, that will be a parameter. But usually you should not be trying to push it a lot. Pushing it a lot helps no one. It will be sticking onto the peel. It will not be a pleasurable experience for you or for the people who are waiting for the pizza. Now, for the fermentation, I will not be necessarily giving you a guideline right now. That will be another video. But for the fermentation, you should really choose an app. This could be the Uni app. I personally use the Pizza app, it's called. And you should really either in the app save the settings you have or write down in a notebook what you did and how it worked out. Different types of yeast will react differently, so the fermentation and how the yeast is calculated in the app could be wrong for the yeast that you're using, even though you chose the right one. For example, I use sourdough, and my sourdough starter works about 20% slower than the sourdough amount that the app suggests. And these are things that you're going to have to work around with, but the fermentation is just another parameter that works hand in hand with hydration. So if your dough is really stiff and you cannot open it easily, that means maybe you have either too short of a fermentation. But if your dough is fluffy enough but still hard to open, that means you have maybe a little too low hydration. And you will see that if you have sometimes too short fermentation, this will result in the dough not fully baking, especially if you have stronger flour, because there is not going to be enough air in the crust for it to bake properly, even at lower temperatures. So if you see that the crust is not fully baking through, you need to really drop down the temperature in the oven and give it a lot more time. In case you cannot wait for the dough balls to get readier. You should also maybe preferably put them near the heat source so that they can puff up a little while waiting for the pizzas. yeah. When you are really pro and really understanding what you're doing, you can start mixing flours. And a really loved mixture is Caputo Red with Caputo Type 1 flour. And you should do around 10 to 15% Type 1 and the rest Caputo Red or Caputo Pizzeria or Caputo Cuoco. That I believe they're all the same. This is like an entire conspiracy thing. Or you could also replace the red one with the blue one. But the mixture is about 10 to 15% Type 1, and that will give it a little bit of a punch. It will taste a little different. And mixing flours is basically trying to modify the taste or how the flour reacts in the oven, and not much else. You will make mistakes, and that is okay. I made enough mistakes. I constantly make mistakes, and I have to learn from them. And learning from them requires understanding what's happening. And for you to understand what's happening, you need to start reading what's on the packaging and really looking and observing your dough balls at every stage of the fermentation, and then thinking about what could be wrong or how could you modify it so that it is better. After years of making pizza, I still sometimes struggle with some types of flour and don't really understand what I'm doing until I modify something and it then works. But generally, the issues you might have regarding stickiness could be too long fermentation or high hydration, and issues regarding stiffness and not puffing up enough in the oven would be related to low hydration and short fermentation. So those are like the two ends, but there is, of course, in between parameters, there is always the temperature, there is the yeast you're using, and those you'll have to figure it out. But my recommendation for that is using fresh yeast from the supermarket and using something local as you can get. You could also ask a bakery for some fresh yeast, and I'm pretty sure they'll be able to provide you with some. And you will be able to understand what is wrong only when you have most parameters fixed and you're only playing with one parameter at a time. If you're changing temperature and fermentation and your flour every time you're making pizza, you will have a hot mess in your hands every time you're making pizza. But if you change your flour or your hydration with your specific flour or your fermentation with your specific flour and trying out, you will eventually have success because you're working one parameter at a time. And I hope that you understood what you can get as a flour. I will put some flours on the screen so you can see which ones I recommend you get, maybe from your local supermarket or online. And if you have a local mill around, go support them. I'm pretty sure the flour is just as good as the flour you can get from the supermarket or from an online shop. And don't really follow random hydration videos online and try to mimic it with your own all-purpose flour, because that is not going to work out. I have done it. It didn't work out. I'm just making this video so after years of making pizza, at least my choice of flour can help you out with your choice of flour. Use a good brand, get some good flour, and your life will be 10 times easier than all-purpose flour. Thanks a lot for watching. Good luck making pizza.